One thing that I think we have to understand as a public, as a community across America, is that we're not necessarily going to arrest and prosecute our way to a solution. I think it's really important that we're doing everything that we can to have the right system of response, hold perpetrators accountable, and to serve the victims, right? But at the same time, one of the things that we're doing really well, I think, in my community in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Ramsey County, is to really understand that concept and recognize that we spend so much money on the back end responding to crime and asking the question about how do we raise boys? Because in the context of gender-based violence, much of the perpetration is done by boys. And if you think about who grow up to be men who do these things, so whether it starts with domestic violence or sex trafficking or whether it's sexual assault, and I say that not to indict men, but to invite everybody as a community to be a part of that conversation. So we've been really intentional about doing a number of things to try to think about getting upstream, in addition to all the great work that we're doing downstream, dealing with the problems when someone calls 911 and we have a domestic violence incident and we have to hold the perpetrator accountable and get victims services that they need, right? But what we've been doing is we've started a campaign called Start by Believing. And what that is really to think about the complexity and the challenges that a victim of a sexual assault faces when a situation happens to them. One of the first things that's going through their mind is whether or not they think that others will believe them, whether or not that they'll lose friendships or there'll be some consequences. And so we've recognized that we needed to kind of unpack that as a community, so we've intentionally started numerous conversations, community conversations about, as a community, how do we better support victims, and one of which is just to really adopt that concept that we start by believing, so that when there's a victim of sexual violence, it's going to be no different than me being a victim of somebody who broke into my garage yesterday. That's what we're trying to develop from a cultural perspective, and then intentionally having that conversation about how we raise boys. Because I think if we truly want to end all of this, right, we really need to be thinking about prevention, not just the response. And if you think about our evolution in domestic violence over the course of the past 40 years, a lot has improved. We used to think that used to be a private issue. Today it's clearly a public one. As a community, we care that there's violence that might be happening in a family, within a home. So there's been dramatic evolution in arrest policies, policing, prosecution, but we still have domestic violence. And I think in order to end these things, we have to have those really important conversations about how we raise boys into men, and think about that from that perspective. Well, I think one of the things that needs to change is the recognition that just because we're a complaint-based system, right? So what I mean by that is we're like this giant assembly line in the criminal justice system, and unless you call 911 or you raise your hand and say this is happening to me, you're not necessarily going to be on that assembly line. And we have to recognize as a society and as a community that there are so many victims who don't raise their hand in the context of sexual violence. So just in the area of, let's say, sex trafficking, there's so many kids that are just right in front of our eyes, or living in our communities, but they're actually in our child protection programs, they're in our juvenile delinquency programs, and they're right there. They're being sexually exploited, and oftentimes many of them are being trafficked. But we're not seeing them because they're not raising their hand. But the reality is that this is happening over and over again in our communities. We also know, just through survey data, that the numbers of women who at one point in their life would say that they had been a victim of a rape or domestic abuse or stalking is just an extraordinary amount of people. But many of them are not raising their hands. So I think in the system and as a community, we need to be more intentional about creating the environments in which people can raise their hand, and then also, for if that happens, that the systems in our community are in a place to respond in a very positive and productive way.